Updated one cells in Greek life. L9 good evening, dear friends. If you'll permit me to say so, I do hope you're comfortable. Perhaps your room is just a little dim. Maybe the hum of a distant city or the rustle of leaves outside is just loud enough to remind you that you are not alone in this world. I'm here with you now, somewhere between the twilight and the full dark, where history has a way of creeping up on us, unannounced but never unwelcome. I am sleepy historian, though tonight my mind feels particularly awake, as it tends to do when the subject is wealth in ancient Greece. Not the kind of wealth you might find in the flashbulbs and golden masks of Hollywood's mythic past, but the real, gritty, sometimes absurd, always fascinating wealth of aristocrats who lived before coinage, made kings rich, and after barter was still the daily language of trade. Before we begin, if I may be so bold as to ask, where in the world are you listening from tonight? A cozy corner somewhere in Europe, perhaps, or maybe you're tucked away in North America, far enough from the hum of cities that the silence is almost a character itself. Or perhaps you're somewhere else entirely. I'd love to know, if only so I can imagine the sound of your thoughts as they wander along with mine. And while we're on the subject of comfort, if this is your kind of thing, if you found history to be that quiet companion in the late hours when the world feels still, I would be truly grateful for a small token of support. A like here and there, a subscription that follows me around like an obedient dog, or perhaps just the occasional whisper of encouragement in the comments. It's not because I need it. History has a way of feeding itself, but because it makes this little exercise feel less like a monologue and more like a conversation. Now then, let us turn our attention to the question at hand. How rich could an aristocrat become in ancient Greece? And by rich, I don't mean the kind of wealth that buys you a yacht or a mansion on a hill, though, as we'll see, those were not entirely absent. I mean the kind of wealth that came from land, from labor, from luck, and from the peculiar quirks of a society where democracy was still a glimmer in the eye of some, while for others it was little more than a word with a dangerous edge. First, we must understand that wealth in ancient Greece was not measured in dollars or euros, but in things: olive oil, grain, wine, cattle, slaves, and of course, the all-important silver. And it wasn't just about how much you had. It was about what you did asterisk with it. An aristocrat who hoarded his wealth like a dragon would not be seen as truly wealthy in the eyes of his peers. No, true wealth was displayed, not hidden, though discreetly so. You wanted to show that you were rich enough to live well without calling attention to yourself in a way that might invite envy or the wrath of the law. Let's start with the basics. Land. In Greece, particularly in the archaic and classical periods, think 8th to 4th centuries BCE, the aristocrat, asterisk Timocrates asterisk, if you prefer the Greek term, owned land as a matter of course, but not just any land. The best land was near the coast, fertile enough for olives and grapes, but also with access to sea trade, which was where the real money lay. A family that controlled a stretch of coastline in, say, Chios or Lesbos could amass immense wealth through the export of olive oil, wine, and garum, that fish sauce so beloved by the Romans they'd later name an entire province after it. But let's not romanticize this too much. Land ownership was not always a smooth path to riches. Droughts could ruin a harvest, locusts could strip a field bare in a single night, and if you were unlucky enough to own land on the wrong side of Athens' growing empire, you might find yourself paying tribute to Cleon or Pericles without ever seeing a drachma's worth of profit. Still, for the lucky few, land was the bedrock of wealth. A single aristocrat in Sparta, for example, might own as many as 10,000 asterisk plethra, a unit of measurement of land, enough to support multiple households and a comfortable lifestyle. Then there were the mines. Silver mines in Laurion near Athens, in Tharsos, or on the island of Siphanos. These were the gold mines of ancient Greece, though gold is perhaps too generous a term for the lead silver ores that dotted the landscape. Mining was brutal work, often performed by slaves or state-bonded laborers, the asterisk telestai in Athens, but it was also one of the primary sources of wealth for aristocratic families. A mine could yield thousands of talents, enough to fund wars, build temples, or bribe politicians to keep your laws favorable. But here's where things get interesting. Mining wasn't just about extracting silver. It was about control. If you owned the mine, you controlled not only the output, but also the labor, the transport, and the marketing. And if you were clever or ruthless, you could corner the market on silver, driving up prices or manipulating the currency to your advantage. This is how some aristocrats became asterisk oligarchs asterisk, not in the modern sense of the word, but as men who truly ruled through their wealth. Now let's talk about slaves, because no discussion of ancient Greek wealth would be complete without them. Slaves were not just a sign of wealth, they were its engine. A wealthy aristocrat might own hundreds, even thousands of slaves, agricultural workers, household servants, skilled artisans, and if you were particularly unlucky in battle or particularly lucky in piracy, entire families captured from raids on neighboring cities. But owning slaves was not just about brute force. It was also about investment. A slave who could work a loom better than anyone else in the household was worth his weight in silver. A skilled potter or metalworker could produce goods that sold for multiples of their own cost, making them more valuable than a field hand. And then there were the specialized slaves, doctors, architects, even philosophers. Yes, they were enslaved thinkers. Diogenes of Sinope comes to mind. These were not just property, they were assets, and an aristocrat who understood this could turn his household into a self-sustaining economy. But let's not forget the role of politics in all this. Wealth was not just about land, mines, or slaves. It was also about connections. In Athens, for example, an aristocrat might fund public projects, not out of altruism, though there was certainly some of that, but because it was a way to curry favor with the asterisk demos, the people, while subtly ensuring that his own interests were protected. A temple built in his name wasn't just a monument. It was a vote-buying machine, a way to ensure that when laws were passed or tribute was collected, his family's voice would be heard. And then there was the matter of trade. Greece may have been a land of city-states, but its aristocrats were no strangers to commerce. They might not have had the modern concept of a corporation, but they understood partnerships, asterisk heteria, and joint ventures. A family in Corinth or Syracuse could form a consortium with others to ship wine to Italy or olive oil to Egypt, splitting profits while minimizing risk. And if you were ambitious, and perhaps a little unscrupulous, you might engage in what we today call insider trading, using political connections to predict market movements and buy low before selling high. But let's not forget the darker side of wealth in ancient Greece. For every aristocrat who grew rich through honest labor, there were others who used their position to exploit the system. In Sparta, for example, the asterisk ephors, the elected magistrates, had a way of confiscating land from those who fell out of favor, redistributing it to loyalists while enriching themselves in the process. And in Athens, the asterisk syngraphi, debt bonds, could trap farmers in cycles of debt, allowing wealthy creditors to seize their land and labor for generations. Then there was the matter of ostentation, because what is wealth without the occasional flex? An aristocrat who truly wanted to show off his riches would do so subtly. No gaudy jewelry, though that did exist. The Persian aristocracy had a taste for it, but rather in the details. A symposium where the wine was so fine it tasted like liquid amber, a household where slaves moved silently and servants were indistinguishable from free citizens unless you knew their names. And if you wanted to really impress, host a banquet where the meat came from cattle raised on your own estates, the bread from grain milled in your mills, and the wine from vines that bore your family's name. But let's not forget the limits of wealth in ancient Greece. No matter how rich an aristocrat became, he was still bound by the laws of his city-state. In Athens, the laws of Solon had set limits on land ownership. though these were more about preventing monopolies than capping wealth. In Sparta, the asterisk agode system ensured that even the richest citizen could not entirely escape the rigors of military service. And in all Greek cities, there was a certain jealousy of wealth, because what is an aristocrat if not someone who has more than you? So while a man like Pericles might amass fortunes through silver mines and trade, he still had to walk carefully between the envy of his peers and the demands of the asterisk demos asterisk. Now, let's consider some real numbers, because I know you're wondering, just how rich could an aristocrat get? Well, it depends on where you set your bar. In terms of silver, a single talent, about 26 kg or 57 pounds, was the standard measure, though its value fluctuated. At times, a talent of silver could buy a talented craftsman for a year's wages, but during wars or inflationary periods, it might not even cover the cost of a skilled slave. Take, for example, the family of Chars of Lindos. In the 4th century BCE, this man was so wealthy that he funded the construction of the Temple of Athena at Lindos, a project that required an estimated 300 talents or more in silver. That's enough to buy hundreds of slaves, thousands of acres of land, or a small fleet of trading ships. And yet, even this kind of wealth was not infinite. The temple itself cost money to maintain, and Charles would have needed to balance his generosity with the practical needs of his family. Then there are the stories of men like Hipparchus of Rhodes, who allegedly amassed a fortune of 3,000 talents by trading grain during the Second Punic War. That's enough to buy a small army or fund an entire city's defenses for years. But even here, we see the limits. Such wealth could not protect him from the whims of politics. Hipparchus was eventually exiled, or so the rumor goes, because his influence became too great for the comfort of Rhodes' ruling elite. Let's not forget the everyday aristocrat, the one who lived on a modest estate, owned perhaps 50 or 100 slaves, and made his living from the land. For him, wealth was about stability, about ensuring that his children would inherit more than they had, about hosting guests with enough grace to avoid offending them while not appearing desperate for their favor. And then there's the question of legacy. Wealth in ancient Greece wasn't just about what you could buy, it was about what you left behind. A family that could fund a dynasty of priests or maintain a patron-client relationship across generations secured its place in history. A man like Lysander, who grew wealthy through his naval command during the Peloponnesian War, could use his fortune to restore temples and fund festivals, ensuring that his name would be remembered long after he was gone. But here's the thing. Wealth in ancient Greece was never static. It ebbed and flowed with wars, plagues, and economic shifts. A family that was rich one generation might find itself impoverished by the next, whether through bad investments, political missteps, or simply the cruel whims of fate. And yet, for those who navigated it wisely, wealth could be a tool not just for power, but for influence, for culture, and even for philanthropy, if you can call funding a temple philanthropic, when it also happens to make you look like a god in the eyes of your neighbors. Now, let's talk about one of the most fascinating aspects of Greek aristocratic wealth, its intersection with philosophy. Yes, philosophy. Because what better way to show that you were too rich to work than to spend your days pondering the nature of justice? The aristocrats of Athens and Sparta funded the great thinkers of their age not out of intellectual curiosity, though some certainly had that, but because it was a way to signal that they were above mere commerce. A man like Pericles could afford to employ a personal philosopher, not because he needed wisdom for his politics, though he certainly used it, but because he wanted to be seen as the patron of thought itself. And then there's the matter of women in all this. We often forget that aristocratic wealth was not just the domain of men. Women like Aspasia or Timoclea of Rhodes could wield significant economic power, though their influence was usually channeled through their families rather than directly. A wealthy widow, for example, might control vast estates and manage them with a skill that would have made modern CEOs envious. while still being expected to behave with decorum at the symposium. But let's not lose sight of the human cost of all this wealth. Slaves, after all, were people, some skilled, some educated, some treated better than others, but always property. And while it's easy to romanticize the leisure of an aristocrat who could spend his days debating metaphysics with his friends, we should remember that behind every symposium was a household of workers, from cooks and servants to architects and shipbuilders, all laboring under the assumption that their status was permanent. And then there's the matter of debt. In ancient Greece, debt was not just a financial concept, it was a social one. A man who fell into debt could lose his land, his family, even his freedom, though in Athens, Solon's reforms put some limits on this. And yet, for all its dangers, debt also created opportunities. A wealthy aristocrat could lend money to farmers or traders, charging interest that compounded over generations, turning a modest investment into a fortune. But perhaps the most interesting thing about wealth in ancient Greece is how it was perceived to outsiders, whether they were foreign merchants, barbarian kings, or other Greek city-states. Wealth was often seen as a sign of divine favor. If you were rich, it must mean that the gods approved of your family. And if you were really rich, you could even buy your way into myth. Think of Croesus, whose name became synonymous with wealth, or Midas, whose touch turned everything to gold, though, as Herodotus reminds us, he eventually wished he hadn't been so greedy. But let's not forget the role of luck. Some aristocrats got rich through inheritance, sitting on a throne of silver while their forebears had sweated and schemed to build it. Others made their fortunes through trade, through mining, or through sheer audacity, like that one Athenian who bought up all the olive oil in Sicily during a famine, only to sell it back at 10 times the price when the crisis passed. And then there were those who got rich by being in the right place at the right time, like the aristocrats of Athens who cashed in on the Delian League's tribute, or the merchants of Miletus who rode the wave of Persian trade before Alexander's conquests changed everything. Now let's consider the limits. Even the wealthiest aristocrat in ancient Greece could not escape the reality that his city-state was, ultimately, his master. If Athens fell out of favor with its allies, if Sparta turned against a family for political reasons, or if a tyrant decided to seize your land, well, then it was time to pack your bags and hope you'd hidden enough silver in the walls. And yet, for all these limitations, there were moments when an aristocrat could truly feel invincible. When he stood on his balcony, looking out over his estate at sunset, watching his slaves bring in the harvest while his children played in the shade of the olive trees, when the symposium was in full swing and the wine flowed like a river, he might have believed that he had conquered time itself. But let's not forget the irony. For all their power, for all their wealth, the aristocrats of ancient Greece were still bound by the same forces that shaped their world. The whims of the demos, the vagaries of trade, the ever-present threat of war. And while some did grow rich enough to leave a mark on history, others would spend their lives chasing a fortune that always seemed just out of reach. Now, as we near the end of our journey, I find myself wondering, what does it all mean? Is wealth in ancient Greece a story of power and privilege, or is it something more nuanced, a dance between ambition and restraint, between greed and generosity? Perhaps the answer lies in the fact that, for all its material wealth, ancient Greek aristocracy was also a culture of ideas. It was a world where a man could spend his days debating the nature of justice, while his slaves tilled the fields below, or where a woman could wield economic power without ever setting foot in the agora. And yet, for all its grandeur, it was still a world bound by the same human desires as any other. The desire for security, for respect, for legacy. And if that's not a story worth telling, I don't know what is. So as we part ways, I leave you with this thought. Perhaps the true measure of wealth in ancient Greece wasn't in silver or land, but in the stories that were told about it, the legends of Croesus and Midas, the histories of Pericles and Lysander. Because at the end of the day, what is a fortune if not the sum of all the lives it touches?